Thank you, Gunther. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Looks good.
Great. Well, it's really nice to be here and finally to have a platform to talk about digital well-being. Yeah, thank you for all of you who are here. I can actually see Professor Van den Wil from Wageningen there, and been reading her paper on attention seeking recently, and I think she's speaking in this series, if I'm not mistaken. So hello, and nice to see you here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about digital well-being. As Gunther said, this paper is I've given this paper several times, or versions of it, trying to emphasize different aspects of this problem of what digital well-being is, what can we do to improve it practically, what sort of methodologies are best employed to use it, and then focusing on this idea of thinking about how persuasive technologies can be repurposed for better digital well-being and what sorts of ethical issues will come out of that. And I think for me, as a philosopher and an ethicist, that's something where philosophy can make a very tangible contribution to the betterment and improvement of this very contemporary philosophical problem. I think philosophers are often thought about as, engaging in reflection on these age-old problems and topics. But digital well-being, it sort of combines something that's very recent, the advent of widespread use of digital technologies, this ubiquitous digital environment that we now spend most of our lives with, particularly post-COVID, of course, with some very old questions on the nature of the good life, the nature of well-being, prudential value. So I'll say a few things about that today and try and connect some of those concerns up. Okay, so let's see if I can click through. Yeah, so I'll just say a few things about myself before I go over what I'm going to talk about today. So I first started working on the idea of human flourishing and how to cultivate it during my PhD, and that was looking at the role of passion in human flourishing, thinking about passion, which is something that many of us are told today that we really must pursue our passions, seek them, discover them, and ideally monetize them. So the PhD project really didn't talk about technology at all, and that gave me a great opportunity to do that for my postdoctoral work, starting at Warwick, and then, as Gunther mentioned, moving to TU Delft. And I looked at self-care apps, this idea that an app, a computer program, often hosted on a mobile device, can be used to cultivate character, something that to me as a philosopher, maybe a bit traditional philosopher, thought was quite implausible, that something as trivial as an app, something you download for 99 cents, can actually have any real effect on something as important and sort of as important and as venerable as character. And then through that project and having the opportunity to visit lots of different self-care app makers in the US, on the East Coast and the West Coast in 2019, I became very convinced that actually there was a lot here. There was a lot of stuff, particularly to do with the techniques that these app developers were employing. For example, some of the persuasive techniques to get us to cultivate character in a deeper way, to make it easier to do that. And I'll talk a bit about that research today at the end of the presentation when I talk about Forest, which is an app that I know some of you will be familiar with, and the way in which they use gamification to nudge us towards a better kind of relationship with particularly social media, but with our mobile devices more generally. So apps, that was the sort of takeaway, that the techniques are very good. The other side of the takeaway was that the ethical ideals to which they direct us towards, many of these companies, they're all quite different, but also they have something in common insofar as I think they could benefit from some contributions from the philosophical tradition, thinking about what the good life is. I mean, philosophers have reflected on this question for over 2,500 years. So you might think there might be something that could be useful there. And I think philosophers don't always do a good job at explaining why these very deep reflections on human flourishing have got a real practical ability to to improve life in a practical way. There's often a divide between theoretical discussions of the good life and well-being and ethical concerns, and then a sort of practical implementation of those concerns. And philosophers can be a bit stuffy about people who engage in those practically orientated kinds of disciplines, such as therapy, such as self-help, such as self-care. Okay, I shouldn't talk too much about this, but so quite naturally then, of course, the pandemic sort of hit when I was at Delft and started to think about digital well-being more generally, thinking about how, and this is one of the problems I will talk about a bit at the end, how we can scale up some of these insights from apps, very small programs that are often remedial for people that need to have better digital well-being, to the level of an operating system, or to the level of a search engine, or to the level of a way in which we use technology and our devices in a more general sense. So that really was compounded by the pandemic and the fact that we were required to work and spend a lot more time, work, socialize, entertain ourselves often, all these things online. And that was sort of where the research is now, and looking ahead to more stuff. So I've given this presentation before because it will be some sort of book project on these topics. I'm really interested in all your questions and advice, and please do not spare me. I think I've heard most of the kind of objections and replies to the things I'll talk about today, but if there are any more, I'd be really pleased to hear them, particularly to have some of the intercultural things that this group has been traditionally very interested in, some of those intercultural perspectives. I'd really welcome that. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about what digital well-being is. I think it can be something of a funny sort of term. Some philosophers can be a little bit, including myself, a bit sort of worried about what's the digital doing here when we're talking about well-being. And I'll say something about what threatens digital well-being. I think many of you will have your own ideas about where those threats come from. But I will talk a bit about persuasive technologies in that context. And then I'll look at the existing strategies which try to improve digital well-being, the way in which this literature has developed reflection and also practical strategies to improve digital well-being, how they have kind of come across in the last 10 to 15 years. And then I'll sort of put forward a very tentative proposal about this idea of repurposing persuasive technologies for better digital well-being. And then I'll draw, as I mentioned before, some of my work on self-care apps and how particularly Forest app is very good at providing a kind of model about repurposing, but one which it's quite difficult to imagine, I think, scaling up to the level of an operating system or to some sort of bigger platform. Okay, and I'd like to break for a discussion. Okay, so what is digital well-being? Okay, so I'll start with this, what I consider to be a classic definition from Christopher Burr and Luciano Floridi in The Ethics of Digital Wellbeing, their edited book on this topic, which came out just before the pandemic. So Floridi and Burr define it quite in a quite sort of commonsensical manner, I think, as the impact of digital technologies on wellbeing. So you have well-being, and then you have digital technologies, and in some ways, well-being is affected by digital technologies, a little bit like we have a concept of social well-being, and that would be how our social interactions affect our well-being. This is quite different to something like emotional well-being, which is the part of ourselves, which is our emotions and how that is a constitutive part of well-being, and we're isolating when we're talking about emotional well-being, a particular type of well-being, a particular side of it. So when we're talking about digital technologies, we're talking about how these external things affect us. And that seems to be quite commonsensical and does align roughly with how the term is used every day, even in the wellness industry. That's the sort of thing they're talking about. Okay. So what is well-being, you might think, and what do philosophers think well-being is? How would this be different to some of the other notions, I think more hazy notions of well-being that are out there? I think this is one area where philosophers can be quite useful in providing these rather, I hope, definitions with a lot of clarity. So when we're talking about well-being, we're talking about prudential value. And as Roger Crisp quite helpfully puts it, really lays it out, what is non-instrumentally good for a person's own sake. So I'll say something in a moment about how that relates to moral concerns. But when we're thinking about well-being, we're thinking about what's in it for us, what it means to lead a good life for us, rather than the duties and obligations we have to other people. Now, different traditions have different philosophical or ethical traditions, have different perspectives on this, the sort of the amount of importance that they accord to these various different perspectives. Now, for example, utilitarianism thinks that, you know, to increase one's own to increase one's well-being, to increase prudential value, that counts. That should be a consideration when we're thinking about how to act. Whereas Kantians, on the other hand, in fact, Kant notoriously says in the Anthropology that we don't need an account of well-being. We don't need an account of what's in it for us, because that kind of looks after itself. What's hard is the moral project of thinking about what we owe other people. And I think whichever way you want to jump on that, I think it's kind of, there's something right about that, at least, that we don't necessarily need to think about well-being when we're thinking about the importance of our duties and obligations to other people. Now, unfortunately, with digital technologies, I think that sort of starts to change. Now, one reason for this, as Roger Crisp notes, maybe pushing back against Kant a little bit, as I suppose Roger would do, he notes that much attention within the moral philosophy literature has been paid to moral normativity specifically, rather than prudential normativity. Okay, and I think we have seen this reflected in the literature in philosophy of technology. And I've put on the slideshow Dean Cocking and Jeroen van den Hoven's amazing book, Evil Online, just because I think it really exemplifies this sort of attention, this well, as you can see by the title, this kind of focus of attention towards moral normativity, these particular concerns. And in that book, they don't talk about the prudential side of things. I mean, they've got no reason why they should, because that's what the book's about. It's about evil online. And the first chapter is particularly striking. So it lists all of these moral misdemeanors that can happen when people use digital technologies, specifically the internet, to create situations which are really unprecedented. What they don't talk about is the effect of online technologies on ourselves. It's their ability to trespass and bypass our duties and obligations and to cause harm. So I think this is reflected in the literature, and yet it's really important. Maybe it does have priority to talk about the moral normativity side of things first, but I think this prudential normativity thing is really important too. And I'm hoping to persuade you of that today and to get you excited about why we should think about doing something about digital well-being and the various strategies that we might sort of take up to do this. Okay, so this might be the most controversial slide of the presentation, just because this is the way I sort of see things laid out. I mean, I'll start with this distinction between moral philosophy and ethics. And there is some people like John Sklopsky, people like Bernard Williams do make a distinction here, Edward Harcourt, between ethics and morality. And it's a sort of a bit of an old chestnut, because obviously we have chairs of ethics, and they will often do be working on issues to do with moral normativity. We have journals of moral philosophy, and they often do things which are talked about in terms of ethics. But I think there's a useful way of breaking this up if we want to think about prudential value as distinct from moral value. We need a sort of a bridging term which sort of captures an umbrella term that captures both of those. And I think ethics is a good way to do that. I could talk a little bit about the etymological story of why that could be useful later. But the basic thing, the basic sort of side of that is to think about the word ethos and think about way of life, which does seem to be a lot broader than just your duties and obligations to other people. It seems to be a much more expansive project when we're thinking about the ethos. What is a good life? What does a good life look like? What does a fully flourishing life look like? Seems like that includes things over and above moral concerns, unless you're somebody like Socrates or some of the Stoics who think that actually you can have a fully flourishing life just by meeting your moral obligations and duties. I think most of us think that's not true. So I think this notion of ethics or ethos does incorporate moral value and prudential value. At least that's how I'm going to use the terms in this presentation. I've also put aesthetic value in there because I think there's some really interesting questions about the role of aesthetic value and the sorts of decisions relating to style and lifestyle particularly that come under this very sort of expanded notion of ethics. But yeah, maybe we can come back to a discussion of this a bit later. Okay, so when we're talking about well-being, we've isolated the part of it, the prudential value part. But then some of you might be thinking, well, of course, what notion of well-being do you have? Now, of course, there are traditionally, as Derek Parfit helpfully points out, these three types of theories of well-being. You know, we have a hedonistic conception, we have desire fulfillment theories, and we have objective list theories. Now, I think there is some, and I hope to do some work on this, and I hope to publish something on this at some point. But there is some kind of affinities, I think, within the tech industry who people within that world often talk about their notion of well-being in terms of hedonism or in terms of desire fulfillment. It can often be a story about we're just giving people what they want. It's where we can absent our responsibility in this way. We're giving people what they want. They're choosing to go in this particular direction. We don't have any view about what is really good for the person. That's the sort of desire fulfillment model, or also hedonism in terms of dopamine spikes and the sort of capacity to create digital situations where people are entertaining themselves and obviously there's a huge amount of pleasure to be had from online technologies, which I think philosophers don't perhaps underestimate sometimes. Because, of course, those moral problems that Jeroen and Dean Cocking mention are also very important. So my view about this is that I think most people, well, maybe it's a big statement, but I think objective list theories, I mean, that's certainly the tradition I'm coming out of with this topic. So if you are a desire fulfillment theorist or a hedonist, maybe some of this will kind of lose you because you might be like, well, within the subjective well-being tradition, which a lot of psychology is based on, although there has been a increasing interest in more eudaimonic approaches, which are obviously associated with objective list theories. We might be thinking that the notion of well-being that I'm going to be developing is too sort of it's too objective, if you like. It's too sort of it's too thick a concept. So I'm going to give you quite a thick conception, or I'm at least working with a thick conception in mind. Now, what are these objective list theories? And I think, you know, it's been really fun recently teaching some of this stuff to the students at Eindhoven, because you can ask them, you know, what sort of theorist of well-being are you, or what sort of conception of well-being do you have? And often you'll get a number, you'll get a sort of, initially, a lot of people are attracted by either hedonism or desire fulfillment, and then you start cashing it out about the consequence of the sort of implications of those theories. The fact that actually, you know, if you have young children that you're in charge of in some way, that often when they're walking past the sweet shop, you suddenly don't think of it in terms of a hedonistic or a desire fulfillment situation. It's much more about what's objectively good for them if you're being a responsible guardian. So it's interesting how they sort of shift. There is a sort of propensity to be, towards this hedonism and desire fulfillment, but I think that quickly drops away. If we look at what's on the list of objective list theories, this is just taken from Guy Fletcher, really philosopher from Edinburgh. The various different things that are on the list, there are some things that are pretty consistently on the list. You might see sociability on Finnis's list, or friendship. Friendship appears on most lists. Parfit's list is notoriously out of date, I think. Having children and being a good parent for Parfit, you can't enjoy well-being in the full-fledged sense of the term unless you have that. I think that seems enormously old-fashioned, if not somewhat unprogressive to many people here, I would imagine, certainly to me. So, but there are these list theories that we need to be considering when we're thinking about what particularly is the thing that digital technologies are threatening. Okay, so what threatens digital well-being? I've already given you a clue here. I've let it slip. It's persuasive technologies. And I don't really have a good slide for persuasive technologies, partly because they're often invisible. They're often things which are completely structuring our digital experience, but we can't actually see them. But there are some examples, which is why I've used the forward, the retweet, and the liking button. These are types of, they're kind of devices which have some persuasive element. I've also listed some examples on the slideshow. So e-nudges, notifications, those little red dots in the corner, micro-targeting, and they all occupy a kind of different sort of conceptual space. I think some of them are sort of discrete sort of widgets and particular things, and others are a more sort of general concept like micro-targeting or even gamification. But gamification is what I'm going to be talking about in a moment. Okay, so I want to mention Shoshana Zuboff because I think this kind of story of the business model helps us understand why this is a really live issue at the moment and why digital well-being is becoming an increasing concern. In 2018, Google declared it as the theme within their App Store of the year, digital well-being and self-care. And I think there has been, particularly during the pandemic, all of these cases of burnout, there's been an increasing interest in thinking about what digital well-being is and how we can improve it, particularly the latter question, actually, less so philosophical reflection on it. But Zuboff tells a very powerful story of how initially Persuasive Technologies, it was just or social media platforms, used this traditional method of newspaper, like a print newspaper. You see an advert, and then next to the advert you see something, a news story that you want to read, and you read the news story, and then you direct user attention towards the advert. So you read the news story because you care about what's going to happen in the world, what's happening in the world, and then you see a picture of a Rolex or a holiday, and you hadn't considered buying that or going on holiday to that place, and then you start thinking about it. And then there was this shift, and Zuboff talks about this she identifies it around sort of 2010, that sort of time, when big tech companies realized that it was only one part of the business model to direct user attention towards adverts in that traditional print media way. And actually, a much more valuable source of revenue was to scrape data. So just to increase user engagement, doesn't matter about the news story, doesn't matter about quality journalism. All that mattered is to get users engaging as much as possible online, clicking, scrolling, and swiping. So the more they did that, then those cookies that are installed on the websites are able to harvest masses of data, which then could be sold to third parties. So most apps that you will use, including many self-care apps and even some digital well-being apps, will sell your data to third parties because of the cookie agreements and the other sorts of the sorts of technologies and the sort of the user agreement that you will sign to be able to access the app means that your data can be sold. And that can be something that's very valuable to companies who can use it in a positive way, obviously, or a negative way for even more obvious reasons. Okay, so I think that sort of really changed, this business model story really changed the landscape of digital well-being, because suddenly it didn't really matter what you were clicking, scrolling, and swiping on. All that mattered was that you were doing it as much as possible. So it became a lot more serious. And if we think about the clickbait, the sort of 15-second videos, the TikToks, the snaps that we have today, these highly compulsive technologies really came out of that business model of just not caring what users do online, just caring that they engage as much as possible. Okay, so which strategies are out there to improve digital well-being? So I'm going to run through them. So the first one, and they are kind of in sequential order, so this is the first sort of the way the whole debate started, was that users needed to have certain virtues or capabilities, often the virtue of moderation. They needed to moderate their use of online technologies. And this ability to moderate your use was able to, that was the source of having good digital well-being, having some sort of capacity for moderation. This literature, so just to flesh out who said that, people like Shannon Valler said that, and then also Shannon included, and I've said this too in previous work, then tried to extrapolate this account of users, the character traits of users, to the character traits of designers, who is designing these particular products, and the character traits that they need to have in order to design in a wise or ethical or a far-sighted way. So the literature began with looking at the character traits of users, Then it moved to the character traits of designers, people who work in Silicon Valley, and many of us who teach in technical universities, such as Eindhoven, such as myself and Gunther. That's a large part of it, is to get the people that are going to go on to design these technologies, the next generation of them, to have instilled in them some sorts of character traits that enable them to design, or at least be able to consider and reflect upon the ethical issues. Third one, the regulation of tech companies. I put some flags in there and some organizational insignia, and I'll talk a little bit about the various different initiatives. It's very interesting at the moment, the Digital Services Act just being passed, and there has been some, there are some things in that which are not called digital wellbeing. They're not regulations for digital wellbeing as such, but they are good proxies for digital wellbeing. And I'll talk a bit about China and their attempt at regulating for it too. And then this final one, this idea of repurposing persuasive technologies, this idea of designing platforms in a way that nudge us and direct us passively towards a better relationship with technology and the various different ethical issues with that. I don't have good answers to that, so we might get to the end and you'll be disappointed. But I think actually understanding how this whole development of the literature goes is a really valuable exercise and really gets this idea of repurposing persuasive technologies into focus. Okay, so I'll start with these first wave approaches and break them down. One thing to note is I have a little tick in the sort of a tick box there, because I think we need first wave approaches. I think there was maybe a kind of a first response to them, which was they might be sufficient. I don't think they're sufficient, but I do think they are necessary. So that's why in each of these approaches has a little tick, because I think they're important. So what are these user-based strategies? So on this slide, I've put on the motifs, or the what are they called? The logos of big tech, because big tech are very keen on this. Also, the Center for Humane Technology. So some of you may know these people. So Tristan Harris was one of the main co-founder who used to work for Google, and they really did, and even now a lot of their work concerns how users could think more deeply about developing a better relationship with technology in terms of the character traits that these users have, their ability to refrain, and those sorts of so-called hacks of putting your phone outside the bedroom when you sleep and not using it at the dinner table. Those sorts of character-based approaches are really important for Center for Humane Technology. Now, I've written about this as a sort of critique of these sorts of user-based approaches. And this paper describes this idea of what I call the McDonald's model. McDonald's hasn't sued me for using their name yet, so I'm hoping they're going to not be reading Science and Engineering Ethics, but maybe. So the idea of the McDonald's model, this is because big tech with this user-based approach has adopted a very similar sort of approach to the way in which the fast food industry responded in the 1990s to the threat of legislation that would have meant that they would have to change their menus and the sorts of products that they were able to serve, because obviously fast food can be highly calorific, can have high levels of salt and sugar, that sort of thing. So the lawyers of these companies came up with a great strategy, I think, one that I think is just followed by, which has been followed by big tech with these user accounts. So they promoted this idea that actually it's okay to eat fast food. We don't need to change our recipes. All we need to do is to emphasize that users must eat fast food in moderation. So the burden goes on to users, the burden of responsibility to moderate their use of fast food. And there was this phrase that some of you may remember, as part of a healthy lifestyle. So you can have a burger, you can have the fries, you can have the thick shake, but that's got to be, you've got to go and play football afterwards. You've got to, go for a run or do Pilates, whatever it is, whatever your thing is. So they could sell, and it was to evade the threat of regulation, as long as these products were thought of as something that could have a healthy lifestyle, could be surrounded by a healthy lifestyle. And I think exactly the same strategy has been used by big tech, and that's one reason why, starting from 2018, each of the companies with the logo on the slideshow launched a digital wellbeing page on their corporate website, which explains to users how they can moderate their use of the particular product concerned by better character traits and these sort of hacks of taking your phone outside and making sure you meet real friends once in a while, that sort of thing. So I think it was a powerful legal strategy, but also somewhat disingenuous, like the fast food industry, because as we know, there are lots of people within our society that don't have the ability to moderate their consumption of either social media or fast food. And if you look at the empirical literature on this, it's really interesting. It looks like around 5% of most populations have some kind of self-regulatory problems with, problems to regulate. I mean, I think I'm probably almost in that percentage because, not so much fast food, but the ability to regulate, to self-regulate for some individuals can be very hard, and for others it's absolutely fine. So then the question is, do you change what's available and you ban this for 95% of the population just to save that 5%, or do you just sort of do something remedial for the 5%? That's a big question. Okay, so
can I interrupt you, Matthew? Yeah. You're presenting a bit more than 30 minutes now, so if you want to have a good discussion afterwards, maybe wrap up in like 5 minutes. Is that possible?
For sure, but I thought it was, maybe I've got this wrong, but maybe it was 90 minutes. I thought it was 90 minutes that we were.
It's 90 minutes, but we always try to have an hour of discussion. But if you need more, then take your time.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll go a bit more quickly. I can just pass over this. But I'll just mention that for the social dilemma, which many of you will have seen, there is this very nice moment in it where one of the interviewees from the Centre for Humane Technology actually points out that in no other industry, apart from the illegal drugs industry, are customers called users. And that's a similar sort of, and it's a very obviously very anecdotal, very flippant comment. But I think it sort of points to the idea that there is an awareness within that culture that users are not just simple customers who can choose or not choose to use the product. These products are extremely compulsive, if not addictive for some groups of users. Okay, second wave approaches. I'll go over this a bit more quickly now. Just note the ticks. I think we definitely need this. We do need to think about the virtues or vices of designers. Just note Frances Haugen, which many of you will be aware of, who was a whistleblower for, came out of Meta, but also working on the Instagram account, part of that business. And then Tristan Harris, of course, who used to work for Google. Both of them are whistleblowers. And then you've got someone like Mark. So, just thinking about the character traits that designers have. So third wave approaches, thinking about the role of regulation in this space, whether we should regulate for digital well-being. Well, there has been some sort of move to do this. If we think about the regulation of gaming in China, the first regulation came out in 2019, and there was an update to it in 2021, which means now that you can only game if you're under 18 for 1 hour a day on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. I think it is. I should get that right. But so it's just to say that it's possible to regulate from this top down, in this top down way, of the amount of online stuff that people consume. But for obvious concerns, obvious sort of ethical, philosophical concerns to do with perfectionism and paternalism, that is something that we should tread lightly with. Just to say, it's not necessarily digital well-being as such that the Chinese regulation is aimed at. It's also to do with the content of certain games. So nudity and blood, I think, are both things within that regulation that it regulates against, showing. Okay, the fourth wave approaches this notion of repurposing persuasive technologies. So I think we do need all of these different approaches, but it's working out whether repurposing has some role to play. So what might it look like? I did mention, I talked about Forest, which is one of the apps that I looked at in 2019, and then have subsequently had quite a lot of dealings with. I saw Joel Anderson in the room, and I think he's done some work on this, and Gunther too. So for those of you who don't know Forest, I think it has become quite popular now, so I don't want to go over it if it is something you're all familiar with. The idea is, it's an example of gamification, a product that uses gamification to improve digital well-being. So basically, when you log off your mobile devices, if you're having a sort of focused day and you're not checking online, you're not checking Instagram or sending that tweet at lunchtime, whatever it might be, then your app will grow this small virtual tree. And then if you do check social media, then the tree dies. Now, you might think, well, why would somebody care about this virtual tree dying? Well, it's an example of gamification. So people really get quite attached to the forests that they grow, the virtual forests that they grow. And this really dramatically has a big effect on how they use technology, use these particular social media technologies particularly. Forests do actually plant a tree for every one that you successfully grow. So there is a sort of an external, extrinsic motivation as well as just the virtual one. Okay, so maybe just flick through this, but yeah, just thinking about these technologies of self-persuasion and wondering whether this could be the fourth type of approach that we need when we're thinking about how to improve digital well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, and sorry for not making clear that there was only 30 to 35 minutes, but thanks for wrapping up.